Hi, everybody. Dr. Friedman here. This week is week 4 in the class on Introduction to Literary Studies. And this week, I focused on a game that cannot be purchased in the physical form that we encountered it in for a lot of different reasons, but is still available in PDF, and I have every belief that it will be available again someday in different kinds of forms. That game is Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. And depending on who you are, you may or may not know why I'm having such a solemn tone for such a bright pink box. At the time that I'm recording this, there has been media coverage inside the hobby that outlines the ongoing legal dispute between Possum Creek Games, the creators of Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast, and different collaborators under different kinds of contractual agreements that are still in dispute, as Possum Creek Games was acquired by Steve Jackson Games, and thus new contracts have evolved. It's an incredibly complex scenario, and one that is, in the fullness of time, as a book historian, something that I think is worthy of attention and thought, especially since I was using this game in order to walk through our initial play report form, which begins with the question of who the author of a game is. My students answered literally anyone who writes on the game. And of course, that is one way of thinking about this, and a really powerful way. And we talked about the ways in which science often has many authors on a work, and conversely, the way that auteur theory often collapses into one name, the work of many. These are complicated issues, especially when you're talking about how to shorthand something. This game was designed by Maisie Veselak, credited as M. Veselak, and Jay Dragon. There is additional writing by multiple additional authors. This is the current dispute. And so, if you look at the very first page, you will see Mercedes Acosta, Jay Dragon, Lillie J. Harris, and M. Veselak are credited as written by. But then, of course, it's also worth noting that this is a game, not just a written text, although the writing is one of the beating hearts of this text. Art direction by Ruby Lavin, concept art by Aster Santiago, edited by Dominique Dickey and M. Veselak, narrative editing by L.D. Lewis, mechanical editing by Kazumi Chin, accessibility editing by Kyra Helfrich, game design consultation by Avery Alder, layout by Ruby Lavin, cover art by Katie Hicks, mechanical art for tracks, clocks, shelves, stickers, and ornamentation by Shannon Kao, additional mechanical art by Aster Santiago, character portraits by Val Wise, early chapter headers by Ashanti Fortson, intermediate chapter headers by Marjulia, later chapter headers by Val Wise, splash illustrations by Alxndra Cook, I hope I got that right, Hey Kids art by Valentine de la Rosa, additional art, if you can find it, by Hannah Chatani, the Night Dance splash art by Adam D'Souza, Scytholith glyphs and extra rabbits by Beetle and Jay, and Heartsword spot illustration by Hodag. That's a lot. That's film credits, right? And if we look at most games of this size and complexity, we are going to see that many folks. And of course, it's worth noting what isn't credited, which is to say, this is a physical object that has a lot of moving parts, literally a box of trinkets and tchotchkes. And how those are made is not actually outlined here, because that's often what we might think of as below the line in the way that film thinks about credit and these sorts of things. Credit is incredibly important, and figuring out how collectives share in profits when there are profits, especially in these kinds of times of flexible transformation, is incredibly challenging. And it's worth teaching these kinds of controversies, not to necessarily endorse one side or the other, but to acknowledge that there is nuance and there is gray area and there is difficulty. And indeed, I am making a video in a time where this is not a settled case. And to be quite transparent, as I was transparent to my students, I have friends, true friends, who are reporters at Rascal, some of whom have been involved in the writing of the piece that is circulating this to a wider audience. And Jay Dragon is my friend. That's a lot. And I seriously considered not recording a video at all. And as I am recording this, unscripted, I'm not sure whether I will release it exclusively to my Patreon or whether I will share it with YouTube at large. This is delicate stuff in a fraught time of high emotions, and my appearance, even just talking about the work, is seen and can be read in all kinds of ways. But I'm a professor, and I am trying to accurately represent what I did in class this week. So I began by crediting everyone involved with the making of this book. And what's interesting about credit and authority, especially around Yazeba's, which is why I find Yazeba's to be a useful case study, is the fact that it explicitly rejects the traditional notions of canon authorities. In other words, this is a game that is inspired by Saturday morning cartoons and by fan fiction, and rejects the idea that any one person has narrative control, even at the level of a character. When I set out to play Yazeba's, I open up the ledger, or a stack of character sheets that I have unlocked, and I get to pick one. And it's very likely that someone else has played that character before, that this character already has a history before I even touch it, that I'm then going to impact. And then I get to hand off that character to someone else. I ran this for my home game a little while ago, and one of the things that my home game players, who are very familiar with D20 style games, they became really attached to an individual character. And I kind of wish that we'd played 2 chapters and that I'd forced them to switch just to get used to that destabilization and defamiliarization. I like teaching this game the way I like teaching a lot of GM-less games, precisely because I can turn to the student who's never played a game before or played very few role-playing games at this point and say, you are very likely to be the person who is best at this game of everyone at the table, because you don't have preconceived notions about what it means to have a play turn, take a turn, build a character, those sorts of things. And in fact, that is indeed the case. I run this game for the moment where I see a student look me in the eye, as they did this week, and say, Dr. Friedman, I think I could get good at this. That is the power of many role-playing games, but I found this to be a particularly useful onboarding experience. And not just because I also get to document, thanks to this ledger, all of the students and other friends and family members who have played this game with me. That's part of the documentation, which is a kind of incredibly moving sentiment, and one that I haven't seen in other games. If there are other games that include that kind of ritualistic inscribing, I would be very curious to hear about them. I'm also a sucker for games, and my students are suckers for games that have bits and bobs or trinkets and tchotchkes. This is the deluxe version of the game. It will probably never be sold again. It's hard to say. Um, there is a forbidden envelope, and I promise you, I actually have not opened the forbidden envelope in my copy, even though the wax seal has come loose. Um, there are stickers and a deck of cards and bags of jewels and tokens that have been made specifically for this edition. And that's really cool. But what I want to note is that at the beginning of last year, I ran this game as part of a project to introduce role playing games to my friends who are parents, specifically female identified parents, moms, who often did not have this as part of their childhood hobby and are statistically likely to feel like they have less time. And this is an underserved part of the market, I believe, in a lot of ways. A lot of the time, the ways in which we appeal to moms is the idea that they want to play with their kids. And I can assure you that, for example, my sister loves playing games with my nephew. I love playing games with my nephew. My sister would rather eat glass than play a role-playing game with my nephew, given their very different tastes and play styles. But this worked. And this worked so well that when I played with her and my best friend actually created a mom's group. And of course, she can't buy a physical copy of this game. So she's literally rolled her own with a binder and stickers of her own and printing out the parts of the game that she wants at any given time. And I think there's a real possibility space that opens up, possibly in the future and certainly right now. And there's a whole video that I kind of want to record for this purpose. And this is something I talked about with students is the physicality of an object matters. We read this and its colors and its dimensions. I had to bring my big suitcase backpack just to haul this sucker to class. I literally find it very difficult to travel with this. The last time I put it in my suitcase, I was stopped by TSA literally every time I walked through security. And then they asked if it was a video game, and I got to tell them, have you heard of the wonderful world of tabletop role-playing games? But again, I don't actually want to unpack my suitcase every time I fly. No one does. And so this is an onerous object in a lot of ways, as well as being a beautiful object, a beautiful design object, and one that, depending on how various things work themselves out, will not exist in this particular form again. It is of its moment. And I realized that in addition to my students, many of the people who watch these videos with care and attention, maybe more than my students, because most of my students were in class, is the future. And in fact, some of my students are future teachers. And so what does it mean for me to teach not only an object that's currently under controversy, which I think is completely within the pale, but also, more importantly, one that is no longer available. If I'm evangelizing about including games in the classroom, what does it mean to have something that you cannot go and buy? Well, you can, just not in this form. So there's that. And I think that the lessons from Yazeba's, while Yazeba's is a particular kind of object that I think opens up a lot of things about materiality and its relation to bookishness and its relationship to genre, you can do that with a lot of other games. And I'm going to be talking about the ways in which we can do that with other games simply by walking through, and I'm going to put this handout on my Patreon, the different questions you can interrogate and ask of a game in the way you would both as a playtester and also as a book historian. What is the impact of the weight and the shape? How is it advertising itself in terms of its relationship to genres, as many of these kinds of games do? Who made it? How many people made it? Do we have a sense that there were play testers or safety consultants? Those kinds of invisible apparatuses. What is the art trying to communicate about what the play experience is going to be like? You don't necessarily have to use Yazebas. Yazebas is just kind of literally the thing in my library that best suits that purpose quickly and engagingly. So yeah, we played Yazebas this week. And it was a challenging week to do so in a weird way because I knew I would be documenting it in this way. My teaching has never been more public than it is right now. And yet, I think it's worth teaching these kinds of contentious objects in context with thoughtful analysis. And it's also a way to talk about the ways in which, because our notion, that very first question of who is the author, it's important to note, and this is when the 18th century in me comes out and comes to class, that the idea that copyright inheres with the author was literally invented in the 18th century, at least in terms of the Anglophone context. Copyright was originally shares in the right of the copy, the physical creation. So the entity that would own this in terms of future profits would be the publisher. That's not true anymore. And also that has no bearing on the current situation in terms of like being applicable case law. But the point is that the period that I originally study is not that long ago. We're talking about a process that happened from the early to 18th century into the late 18th century in terms of the various levels of case law that gradually awarded rights to an author and said that the author has the kind of notion, the moral rights to copyright, unless they actively sign them away, as opposed to the idea that basically everything is sort of what we might understand as work for hire. So yeah, it's also worth noting that these things are culturally specific and contingent. This is also the great debate around AI. This is also the great debate around Creative Commons and all kinds of ways of sharing and collaboration. And of course, this is all because we are operating under capital. That these kinds of logics only matter because there's money and other kinds of tangible benefit that disproportionately move to different kinds of entities in an exchange that make this incredibly complicated. So I don't have a lot of good answers or black and white. It's all very colorful in sometimes the best ways and gray in a lot of the most difficult and painful ways. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a psychologist, and I don't know every single person involved. So, but what I can do is talk about the text and experience it and think about it with my students. And that is what we did this week. If this is available, I will keep the comments open for robust, engaged, and respectful discussion. I will shut them down if it gets out of hand. The last thing that we need is more firing squads and unnuanced and mess. I encourage us to live the question and to hold complexity and hold compassion for reasonable people with strong investments who currently cannot come to an agreement. Take care. See you next week.